Welcome to episode 1, Pavements in Malta. Now, the most evident issue regarding Maltese pavements is that they are far too narrow. They are often so narrow that pedestrians have to walk in single file and uncomfortably close to passing vehicles. As you can see here, pavements can be extremely narrow and often contain multiple obstructions and pinch points. Sometimes they are even less than 60 centimeters wide due to protruding developments. We came across pavements which are built on or totally obstructed, rendering them useless. Even in touristic areas, pavements are often very narrow, and in many villages, the sole purpose of the pavement is to seek refuge from passing vehicles. Now, pavements in Malta are very narrow, but we have to provide evidence. How narrow is narrow? So we searched online and found some local guidelines and design manuals from government departments. And it turns out that there is a minimum requirement for pavement width, and that golden number is 1.3 meters, 130 centimeters. So the absolute minimum width a pavement is required to be is 130 centimeters wide. Naturally, if the pavement sees a high amount of pedestrian traffic, it must be wider to accommodate. Guidelines are also recommended that pavements be kept clear of obstructions and adequately maintained. So we set off measuring and found out that many pavements are substandard, much less than the minimum 1.3 meters. As you can see here, pavements are often useless and pedestrians are forced to walk on the roadway. For comparison, here is an example of a typical pavement in France, and as you can see, they are significantly wider. Besides the width issue, pavements in Malta are often riddled with obstructions. Unfortunately, this renders substandard pavements even narrower. Of course, this hinders pedestrian passage. Pavement obstructions also include garbage, where Maltese habits dictate that garbage is left on pavements for collection, which is fine, provided the collection window is very narrow, but this is not always the case, as the service and residents often fail to adhere to collection times. Malta is undergoing rampant construction, and we frequently notice that in many occasions the pavement becomes almost naturally assimilated into the construction site, often leaving the pedestrian without an alternative but to walk on the roadway. Now, we also identified that there are laws against the obstruction of pavements by the construction industry. And similarly, one must provide a safe passage past the site by means of a temporary pedestrian pavement. As with many laws, failing to comply can result in fines ranging from hundreds to thousands of euros. Temporary pavements are occasionally provided, but due to limited space, they are often extremely narrow. As you can see here, they often force the user onto the road, with children and families having to walk alongside moving cars. Obstructions of pavements is sadly still a common occurrence, and the pedestrian must bear the consequences. Even government contractors often fail to comply with these laws. Here you can see tourists with their suitcases having to walk on a main road due to an absent alternative pavement. Obstructions from cars often reduce the width of pavements by means of vehicle overhang. Even overgrown trees often hinder passage across a pavement. Pavements often disappear into nothing. As you can see here, the pavement is poorly designed, unmaintained, and substandard. This particular type of signage is somewhat odd, as it legitimizes vehicles parking on pedestrian pavements. Excess cars have often resulted in sacrificed pavements in order to provide parking. We also found pavements which are totally absent. Even pedestrian access to one of the island's top hotels is rather poor, with no pavement. Selfish drivers all too frequently park on pavements, rendering it unsafe. You also get double obstructions as well as cars blocking disability access. In towns where unloading zones were not planned in advance, one often finds delivery vehicles haphazardly parking on pavements, even in prime touristic areas. We also found vehicles parked on 500-year-old pavements in Valletta, but one can understand the situation. The island has become so car-centric that it is now impossible to live a good quality of life without owning a car, so it is suspected that residents will gladly sacrifice their pavements for their personal cars. It does, however, make you wonder about the designers of this city, and the fact that 500 years ago, Valletta had wider pavements than in 2017. However, the population density was higher back then. This is a popular street just off Malta's main university. Unfortunately, it has it all: garbage, uneven surfaces, construction and steps, making it look like a third world scene. You also get pavements which are made virtually unusable for young and fit pedestrians, let alone the mobility impaired. Badly maintained pavements, even in touristic areas, sadly are a common sight, and these are almost always damaged by vehicles that park on them, who undoubtedly get off scot-free. Even poorly placed utility poles can hinder pedestrians. This is a national transport plan, which highlighted a poor pedestrian environment. Over 15 months on, we went on site to assess the situation, and unfortunately, things are pretty much the same. There is two-way traffic with pedestrians walking on a priority strip, which is just a faded line of paint. There is no curb or pavement present. In fact, the report perfectly concluded in their patterns identified that there are no adequate facilities for pedestrians and cyclists. You can also see here children and prams entering into a dark, unlit tunnel with just a faded line to denote the pedestrian strip. Again, no lighting, pavement or curb was present. Here you can see pedestrians surrounded by a sea of cars. There's no pavement, no crossing or protection. Pavements are also absent in many areas, forcing people to mingle with cars and making it even harder for the disabled. We also noticed a phenomenon where pavements are absent at fuel station entrances. The least one could expect is a pedestrian priority strip similar to this. In many towns, pavements have been reduced to accommodate for on-street parking, with people having to mingle with cars. Fortunately, however, these speeds are kept to a minimum. Even in touristic areas, pavements are narrow due to parking spaces. You can find it difficult to navigate the pavements. There are also some pavements which require a protective buffer zone, such as a crash barrier. Now, the history of poor pavements goes a long way back. As you can see here, pavements used to be much wider before the invasion of the automobile took place. The decline in pavements coincided with the mass motorization of the island. That being said, we still do get some beautiful wide pavements and promenades, many of them which were left over from the colonial yesteryear period. It is easy to observe that when a locality has good pavements, people flock to them, and at times they also become a tourist attraction, such as Slima. Believe it or not, humans enjoy walking, as demonstrated by the country's popular promenades. The decline has occurred over the past 30+ years, where previous governments' planning, or lack thereof, only took cars into consideration. Towns and villages have thus become dominated by cars, and the poor pedestrian infrastructure is a result of the failed planning. The car is now the only viable mobility option, where many pavements have been narrowed to accommodate car parking, and the situation has deteriorated to the point where the pedestrian has now become a third-class citizen. What does it say about a country that treats its pedestrians, the most vulnerable road users, the worst? Well, it actually says a lot, as studies show that the Maltese hardly walk anymore, and the country is now the most obese nation in the entire EU, by a long margin too. The country also has some of the highest levels of car dependency and cars per capita in the EU. Walking needs to be encouraged. As you can see here, just a 12-minute walk can provide mobility throughout the entire neighborhood of Slima in just 12 minutes. However, pedestrian infrastructure needs to be upgraded to make walking more viable, safe, and pleasant. In the country's recent election, both major political parties mentioned pavement upgrades in their manifestos, as follows. As part of improving the quality of infrastructure, we will invest in the improvement for bicycle users and pedestrians. We will tackle pavements and ensure that trees are planted to provide shade. We will start a great national infrastructure upgrade of pavements and pedestrian zones, with emphasis on accessibility. We need to walk more, both for health and mobility reasons, and recognize that the experience of walking and pedestrian access is not always pleasant due to the day's infrastructural situation. Therefore, with this political interest from both major parties, perhaps we can say that the future of pavements is bright. For example, we also identified newly constructed pavements, and we're pleased to note that at least they conform to the minimum required width, as well as pavements being built in areas for the first time ever. One example on how to improve pavements is to perform a walkability study. Here is just an example where pavements in Bugiba were measured and analyzed by means of Street View to identify poor quality and substandard pavements. As the pavement ranking is performed, they can be rectified, and this process can be repeated throughout the towns on the island. So next time you see a person walking from the comfort of your car, spare a thought for them, as life as a pedestrian on this island is a frustrating situation that will hopefully improve soon enough.